Hello everybody, my name's Paul McKeever and this is another episode of Guitar Philosophy. If you play a guitar, you probably have seen numerous YouTube videos where people are trying to do some tone chasing. So they want to track down what makes Eddie Van Halen's guitar sound the way it does. What's that brown sound? What makes the brown sound? Or you've seen people talk about pedals and, which tube screamer will make my guitar sound the most like Stevie Ray Vaughan's sound. But today we're not going to be looking at pedals or what makes a guitar sound the way it does. Not particularly. We're looking at the perception of guitars. And so I want you to join me on a trip down the rabbit hole as we seek to investigate the question and perhaps even find an answer to the question, does a guitar have a sound? Now, before we get too far into the philosophy, let's just consider a few things. I want to show you what I mean by the object of perception, because that's kind of the main topic that we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to play a bit of music, a bit of Van Halen, just a few chords, and I'm going to be playing my Freedom Caster guitar. If you've been watching my channel at all, you know I built this a few months back. And I'm going to put it through a few pedals on a pedal board, then into a little Yamaha amplifier that's over here on the desk beside me. And I'm going to record that bit of tunage from Van Halen. And then we'll move on from there, and I'll show you what I mean about the object of perception. All right, so you've just seen me play a little bit of that Van Halen lick, Women in Love, on guitar, played through a pedal board that's plugged into a little Yamaha amplifier, and you just heard from the sound of the room what that sounds like. I'm not using any special microphones or anything else. I'm just using the microphone on my iPhone, which is being used to video this. So before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself a question. What were you perceiving? In other words, what were you listening to? Were you listening to my guitar? Were you listening to guitar pedals? Were you listening to the amplifier? What were you perceiving? Now, to get you focused in on this object of perception idea, let's try a little experiment. Let's remove the influence of the pedal board and just play the guitar through the Yamaha amplifier. All right, what was the object of your perception then? We know it couldn't have been the pedals, right? Couldn't have been the sound of the pedals that you were listening to, because there were no pedals in the circuit. There was just the guitar going straight into the amplifier. So what was the object of perception? Were you perceiving the guitar? Were you perceiving the amplifier? Were you perceiving the speakers in the amplifier? What was the object of your perception? What was the thing you were perceiving? Well, let's see if we can take this a step further. Let's take the amplifier out of the mix and go straight into the computer. I've got a little Scarlett box that allows me to put the guitar straight into the box, which will then go straight into the computer where I'm running Audacity. All right, so you've just heard what was recorded by my computer when we plugged the guitar straight into the Scarlett box and the Scarlett box straight into the computer. So there's no effects. In fact, there's no sound in this room around me other than the tinkling of the strings, but no amplifier. Any sound, any volume came out of what was recorded in the computer. So what were you perceiving? Were you perceiving the sound of a computer? Were you perceiving the guitar that plugged into the computer? And let's say you want to say it's the guitar. Okay. What were you hearing? Were you hearing strings on a guitar? Or were you hearing the sound of strings moving a magnetic field and causing a current to go through a wire, which then went into the Scarlett and then went into the computer? Are you really maybe just listening to a changing magnetic field? Is that the changing magnetic field? Is that the object of your perception? Well, let's take the changing magnetic field out of the mix. Let's just play the guitar straight into this iPhone, and you tell me what is the object of your perception. Now you probably figure, well, you've got it all worked out now. There's nothing in between that guitar and this iPhone except some air, right? So you couldn't possibly be listening to a magnetic field. You've got to be listening to the guitar as it really sounds. That is the sound of the guitar. Well, not so fast. Now the philosophers are going to come in and mess with your mind. Now let's start by looking at this guitar, okay? Now it's kind of a figured top, so let's just call that an orangey top or an orange top. Or if you prefer, you could talk about the back of the guitar, which is just black, okay? So I want you to take a moment to consider, does this guitar have color? Is the blackness you see on the back of this guitar, is it actually on the guitar? Is that fiery maple top actually on the guitar? Is that appearance of fire or ripply wood, is that on the guitar? Is that what you're perceiving? Are you perceiving the guitar? Is that the object, the thing that you're perceiving? So let's consider what happens when you look at a guitar. You see light hitting the guitar surface, it bounces back and hits your eye, and the different rods and cones in your eye cause data to be produced that your brain then processes and says, ah, black guitar, fiery top. Or let's think about the sound of a guitar. The sound hits a membrane in your ear and causes it, like a drum, to move, and that movement causes little hairs inside your ear. I don't mean these kinds of hairs, but hair-like things inside the eardrum or ear canal to vibrate, which sends signals to the brain, which you then experience as the sound of the guitar. Okay, so I want you to think of this question now. We've talked about coming down the line from, pedals and amplifiers and straight into the computer and then just hearing it in the air. And I've asked you to consider each time what the object of perception is. So now let's take it a step further and ask, what is the object of perception now that you're thinking about moving eardrums or rods and cones in the eyes? Are you looking at a guitar when you think you're perceiving a guitar, or are you looking at the data that's on your eye? When you hear the guitar, are you hearing the guitar, or are you hearing the movement of your eardrum and those hairs inside your ear canal vibrating? What is the object of your perception? What are you perceiving? Are you perceiving the guitar, or are you perceiving your eardrum? Are you perceiving the guitar, or are you perceiving changing data in your eye? Again, the question is, what is the object of perception, the thing that you're perceiving? So I'm going to take you now through a number of different philosophers' views on perception. Let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle was what they called a direct realist. He believed that when you perceive this guitar, you are seeing that guitar. That guitar is the object of your perception, not something in your eyes or what have you, or something in your ears. You're perceiving the guitar out there. Now, Aristotle had a way of thinking about perception that might seem a bit not consistent with today's views, where we have a lot more information about physiology and etc. But Aristotle took the idea that sound, let's say, forms into, changes the shape in a sense, informs you. Light informs your eye. It takes the force of whatever's coming at it and literally sort of moves or creates an imprint, almost like if you took your fist and you punched it into a big thing of clay, you'd see your finger marks or your knuckle marks in the clay. Well, that's kind of the concept of perception that Aristotle had. So he's saying that the thing in the real world is informing, putting a form to your perceptual devices, and that the thing, therefore, is the object of your perception. The guitar, not what it does to you, is the object of perception. Now, many, many years later, a couple of millennia later, a fellow named Thomas Hobbes. So Aristotle was in Greece prior, like hundreds of years before Jesus. Now we're in around the 1600s in Britain. And Thomas Hobbes says, well, yes, there's an external world and there's a guitar out there. Well, he didn't talk about guitars, but there's a guitar out there, and it does cause, things to happen to your body, your eardrum to shake and rattle, and your eyes to change some kind of chemical process that's going on at any given time. But what you're perceiving is not the thing out in the real world. What you're perceiving is your senses. Well, this kind of idea that you're almost like trapped in kind of like the Matrix. People always talk about there's a glitch in the Matrix. Now, in 1688, along comes another Englishman by the name of John Locke. He was a physician and a philosopher, not an academic, but a physician, a doctor. And he was a bit concerned about this idea that all you see is the effects on your system, the effects on your eyes and ears, etc. He was familiar with an ancient philosopher named Democritus, who had said, basically, well, let me read the quote to you. By convention sweet and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color. In reality, atoms and the void. So Democritus was saying, all that really exists outside of your experience of things, all that's really out there outside of your eyes and ears, is just atoms moving in the void. And we have a sensation that's completely created by our mind. And we have an experience of a world that's just what Democritus called convention. In other words, it's an illusion. It doesn't really exist outside of your brain. John Locke was not willing to concede to Democritus the idea that there's only atoms in the void out there and that everything we think we're seeing is just an illusion in our mind. So he put forward the view that there are two kinds of powers that are held by various objects in the real world: primary powers and secondary powers. A primary power has an effect on your senses in which the thing that the sensation that's created, or the impression or perception that's created in your mind, resembles that which really exists in the world. So this guitar has a shape. You won't be able to see all of it, but it has a shape, and that shape is a primary power of the guitar. And the thing in your mind, the impression that it makes in your mind, the thing you're seeing, resembles the shape of the guitar. So the shape of the mental representation of the guitar in your head is the same as the shape of the guitar in the real world. But Locke said, well, wait a minute, there are also secondary qualities, like color. And Locke said, okay, these ones have the effect on your representations in your mind of the guitar, but the color that you see, whether it's the front of the thing or the back, the black or the fiery top, that isn't really on the guitar in the external world. It's only in your mind. It's only in a representation of the guitar. So for Locke, the upshot is this: you have representations in your mind you have a representation of this guitar, and some of the qualities of the guitar in that representation actually exist in the real world. And so they're similar in your mind because primary powers of the guitar, like the shape, it had a power to create that representation and it resembles the real world. But other qualities, secondary or secondary powers, don't really exist in the real world. This guitar does not have any color in the real world. It's only in your mind. So for Locke, as for Hobbes, the object of perception is still something in your mind. It's just that he's trying to say, but that's okay because the representation in some ways resembles what happens in the real world, or looks like what exists in the real world. So resemblance is good enough. You don't need to directly perceive the guitar if the representation of the guitar in your mind resembles the real guitar in the real world. And that's what he was saying. Now, about 40 years later, a bishop by the name of Berkeley came along, spelt Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay. Bishop Berkeley came along, and I think it was 1710, and wrote a book in which he said, poppycock and horse feathers, there is no external world. Because sensation is what you're perceiving, because you're not perceiving things in the real world, who are you to say that things in the real world exist at all? All that exists is your perceptions. As Berkeley put it, esse est percipi. To exist is to be perceived. If you're perceiving it, it exists. If you don't perceive it, if it's not the object of your perception, you can't say it exists. So Berkeley was what was called an idealist. All that exists for Berkeley is ideas. things in your mind. There is no external world at all. There's no rational way to say there is one, because you can't perceive the external world at all. The object of your perception is the sensations in your mind. You might not even exist as an object, right? It's just the experience of ideas and sensations. You do not have any connection with an external reality. Therefore, you cannot claim there is one. Now, for Berkeley, the question comes up, well, what causes us to experience these various sensations? Well, he's a bishop, so of course his answer is God. God causes all of the experiences that you have in your mind. So along comes one David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, who says, look, I agree that you can't say that you have knowledge of the external world if the object of your perception is just your sensations, the experience you have in your mind. If that's what you're looking at, if you're looking at those sensations, perceptions, obviously you can't say there's an external world causing those sensations. For Hume, they might be caused by interactions with things in the real world, but they might be caused by God. There's just no way that even Berkeley could say God caused the sensations or the flow of sensations to occur. Hume's saying you can't know what caused the sensations, or even if they do have a cause, external to themselves, in some kind of external world. So he's not willing to concede that there is an external world, nor is he willing to concede that there's a God. All you can know is the sensations that you're experiencing, the flow of sensations. You can't know, according to Hume, what's causing them. Now, after Hume and all the rest we've just discussed, came along one of the most influential philosophers in human history, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. And he said, look, the things that you're experiencing, the sound of the guitar, the look of the guitar, those are what he called phenomenal. In other words, they do exist only in your mind. But there is a real world, he said, what he called a noumenal realm, the way things really are. So he split your experience or your worlds into two. The noumenal realm, which you can't perceive, things as they really are, as he said it, in themselves. Then there's this secondary world, the world that's in your mind, which he called the phenomenal realm. And the phenomenal realm is where you see things like shape, color, etc. According to Kant, there's no time and there's no space in the noumenal realm. For Kant, time and space are imposed by your mind on the data that you receive from your eyes, ears, and etc. So we don't know what causes the eyes and the ears and etc. to create these sensations, according to Kant. The noumenal realm isn't knowable. We're blind to it. We're deaf to it. What we've done is receive data from the noumenal realm and then constructed a world in our minds, including time and space and color and shape. It's all a creation of the human mind manipulating data that it receives from the real world, from the noumenal realm, and creating in your mind the phenomenal realm. So what are some of the arguments against the idea that you actually do perceive the world as it really is? Well, consider this a little experiment. Imagine that you have 3 buckets of water. You have one that's got all kinds of ice in it. You have one that's really hot. I won't say burning hot, but really hot, like the hottest of tubs of water you'd want to put your hand into. And in the middle, you're going to have a third tub that's just kind of lukewarm, room temperature. You put one hand in the cold bucket. You put your other hand in the hot bucket. You leave them there for, let's say, 30 seconds, a minute. And now you're going to put both hands in the middle bucket, the lukewarm water bucket, at the same time. And what you'll experience is that the hand that was in the cold water will feel much more warmth from the lukewarm water than the hand that was in the hot water. That hand is going to feel cold when it's put into the lukewarm water. It's used to the hot water. The other hand was used to the cold water. When you put them into the same water, the same lukewarm water, they feel very different. They feel very differently. The two hands will not give you the same sensations. So look, if you put both hands in the same lukewarm water, but the two hands feel different temperatures as a result of being put in the same bucket of water, obviously that bucket of water only has one temperature, yet you're feeling two, one in one hand, one in the other. That suggests that you're not perceiving that bucket of lukewarm water. You're perceiving your sensations of it. Here's one I've had personal experience with. Let's say you go to a Queens of the Stone Age concert, and those concerts are really loud. I think that concert that I saw in Toronto was second only to a Teenage Head concert that I saw in a very small auditorium where they just had Marshalls just blaring. The effect in both cases is you come out of the auditorium and you're out in a quiet neighborhood and someone's talking to you from 2-3 feet away, and it's as though you're listening through a tube and through a distorted kind of phone line. It's just horrible. You're reasonably sure you've ruined your ears. You just cannot hear properly anymore. Well, are you hearing your friend talking to you outside of the auditorium when you hear that distorted conical sound, or are you hearing the sensations? Is the object of your perception your friend's voice, or is it the sensations in your ear, the sound in your ear? That you know, he doesn't sound like a distorted tubey thing. You've heard his voice before, but that's not what you're hearing when he's talking. Well, that's another bit of evidence that suggests that his voice is not the object of perception. Rather, the object of perception is the movement of your eardrum, what have you, or the data that's created by the movement of your eardrum. Something in your mind, something in your person. Here's another example. Perfect pitch. There are people who, without hearing anything, can strike an A440, the 440 hertz, with their voice. They've got perfect pitch. They can remember the sound of an A at 440 hertz and sing it out. And they've heard that somewhere before. Obviously, it's the way they were able to sing it. Well, turns out that when we get older, we don't hear the same frequency at the same frequency. So when a certain note is being played, the older person experiences a different pitch. So the A440 that's being played in the room isn't being experienced as A440. It might be being experienced as something like a G, two tones down. Well, obviously, if A440 is the frequency of the sound in the room, and you're hearing it as a G, the A440, that's evidence that the A440 is not the object of your perception. The thing making the A440, let's say it's a tuning fork, that the object of your perception is not that tuning fork. It's not the vibration of that tuning fork. That the object of your perception is the thing that's causing you to hear G, and that would be something about your ears. So the object of perception in your mind, not external to your mind. Okay, here's another one. The speed of sound is approximately 750 miles per hour. Imagine you've got a giant stack of Marshall amplifiers 1 mile away. And someone standing near the amplifiers, God help them in their hearing, strums the guitar. It takes 5 seconds for that sound to hit you 1 mile away. Now imagine that the person strumming the guitar just did this. Didn't let it ring out, just half second, maybe a second. And so it took 5 seconds for that sound to get from the Marshall amplifiers 1 mile away to your ear. And by the time that sound hit your ear, that guitar was no longer ringing. So as you're hearing the sound of the guitar, the strings aren't even moving on the guitar. What is the object of perception? Is it the guitar? How could it be? The strings aren't even moving. Something that's closer to your ear, something that's 5 seconds later, is the object of your perception. And one interpretation of it would be what you're hearing is actually just your eardrum, because the eardrum moving happened 5 seconds after the other person strummed the guitar. So the object of perception, the argument would go, is not the guitar, but your ears, or whatever data your ear created. The object of perception, the thing you're perceiving, is not the guitar, but something in your head. Now consider this. There are spiders who have hairs on their arms, and they don't hear with ears. They actually do detect movement of air, vibration of air, using hairs on their arms. So they feel something. I don't know, of course, not being a spider, I don't know how their experience of it is, but you can see how movement of hairs on an arm might very well not be experienced the same way movement of an eardrum in your ear is, or the little hairs that are inside your ear canal. does it even matter? Imagine that you're sitting on you're deaf, okay? You're Beethoven, and you're sitting at the piano hitting notes. Your ears are not receiving any sound. You're not able to hear anything, but you can feel it through the, as you hold down the keys, you can feel the vibration of the piano. Well, obviously something is the object of your perception in that kind of situation. Is it the piano, or is it the sensors in your fingers, right? By analogy to the other examples we gave, one could argue that it's the sensations in your fingers that are the object of your perception. And so the same thing for the spider. You experience the sound of guitar with your ears. It feels a guitar. Is the guitar therefore making sound? Or is it just doing something generic that's experienced in different ways? In your mind, it's experienced as sound. Perhaps by the spider, it's not experienced as sound at all. But they're both perhaps caused by the same thing, perhaps the guitar. Unless, of course, you don't believe there's an external world, or that you don't believe you can prove there's an external world, or you have no evidence that there's an external world. Okay, let's look at one other example. Let's go back to John Locke again, 1600s. He reported on one of his patients who said that he experienced the color red, even though he was blind. So this gentleman was blind, this patient was blind. He would experience the color red when he heard a trumpet. This is called synesthesia, where something that most people might hear in one way or experience in one way as a sound are experienced in a different way, by color, by sensation, by something else. Well, if this guitar, let's say, or a trumpet, I'm not doing very well sitting at this. Okay, now you probably hear that as a sound, but there are people on this planet who instead would hear it as a color. In other words, they'd see a color instead of hearing the sound. Synesthesia is the word to describe this sort of cross-wiring. So again, that suggests that the object of perception is not the guitar, but rather the sensations in your mind. And to bring us back full circle, if all you're ever perceiving is the sensations in your mind, if your sensations in your mind are the object of perception, how can you say there's an external world at all? You're unable to see it as it really is. If you can't see it or hear it or touch it, etc., as it really is, how can you know anything at all about it? Now, this is not my view. I do believe you can see the world that exists, and I do believe it exists. I'm not going to share with you that information in this video. My point here in this video is simply to tell you what the predominant views are on sensation. Because believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, what I've just described to you is the predominant view in philosophy, that you do not perceive the external world at all, and that in some cases people will conclude there's no reason to believe there is one. Back to the question that brought us to all of this. Does this guitar have a sound? Give it some thought. Maybe write a few songs about it. And it never hurts to go back to these original sources, whether it's Aristotle or John Locke or Hobbes or Kant or whoever, and to read what they actually had to say, because the worst thing about learning philosophy is feeling like this can't possibly be what was said. McKeever's describing it wrongly. That must be the case. Nobody would have rejected the existence of the external world. That couldn't possibly be the view of most philosophers these days. Sadly, it is. Anyway, till next time, this has been Guitar Philosophy.